You may well never have seen the conduct of President Macron's security forces week after week after week after week after week for 6 whole months. You may not see the citizens of France, a citizenry with some revolutionary history, being bludgeoned, being gassed, being shot, having their eyes knocked out, having their hands cut off. You may not have seen it because, for some reason, the British broadcast and print media have averted their eyes from what's going on in a country 29 miles away from us. Now, it was often said of the left, it was Peter Hitchens that coined it last, that the left in Britain is more concerned with Barcelona than Barnsley. Why then not France? Why not Paris? Why not Marseille? Why is it that nobody in this country, including those who fetishize the form of politics which requires large numbers of people to go onto the streets to air their grievances, how come nobody is interested in the yellow vests in France? Is it because the crowds are too proletarian, too rough, too working class, too white, too incoherent, too disparate? What is it that has stopped the legions of leftists from taking the Eurostar or even the bus to go over and give what they used to call their solidarity to hundreds of thousands, now millions if you count them all up, over 6 months, who are demanding the downfall of their neoliberal austerity heart of the EU government? Maybe that's the clue. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's nothing to do with the class or the demands of the demonstrators. Maybe it's the fact that whilst little spring-heeled Macron is lecturing people all over the world, not just on how they should govern themselves, but who should govern them, appointing the president of Venezuela, demanding the president of Syria must resign, interfering in the Ukraine and elsewhere, and interfering in Libya. How did that go? Yes, it's another anniversary there. But despite the fact he's trying to run the world, Macron cannot run his own streets of his own country, except with the use of massively disproportionate and horrific violence, reminding us, if we needed it, that in the end the state is an armed body of men. And the fate of the yellow vests in France, it's presumably the fate of anyone who stands up and challenges. Now, I believe that Macron's presidency will be broken between the hammer of the mass civil disobedience on the streets of every part of France and the anvil of the upcoming elections in that country, as indeed across the whole of the European Union. Now, I'm not allowed, for good reason, electoral law reasons, to talk about those elections in Britain. But I think I'm entitled to opine that President Macron is headed for a condign defeat in those elections. Speaking of elections, but avoiding any electoral law pitfalls, I've just seen the latest opinion poll for Westminster election voting intentions. Now, Labour is ahead of the Conservatives, 3 points ahead of the Conservatives, and that's obviously dismal reading for Tory MPs and for the government and for most of the people who will probably not publish at least very much of the details of the opinion poll. But here's the really significant thing about the opinion poll. The two main parties are on 30% and 27%, respectively. That's the two great parties of the state, between them commanding the grand total of 57% of the popular vote. Now, when I became active in politics, as a young boy really, the big two parties actually were nearer to 90% of the voting intentions of people. So something's happening in British politics. That much is sure. And you can never be sure what's going to happen next. After all, there was Lord Adonis just last September telling people that if they supported Brexit, they should not vote Labour. And yesterday he's signed a confession like a hostage, prostrating himself in front of the Labour official leadership line, which is not an easy line to follow, I'll grant you. So, the elections are full pelt already. Candidates are being announced all over the place. And we can't, as I said, go into those elections not without discussing every party and every candidate. But there are other places on Twitter and elsewhere where you'll find my take on those elections. Now, when Mrs. Thatcher was first challenged for the Conservative leadership, I was in a place, possibly the most beautiful place that I have ever been, the little island of Sri Lanka. I remember it well. A stalking horse, I forget his name now, an old man, a shambling old fellow, announced that he was standing against Mrs. Thatcher. Of course, as a stalking horse, merely to open up a contest. I fell in love with Sri Lanka on that visit, and I have loved it ever since. And therefore, what happened to the Easter worshippers at a children's mass in various Catholic churches across Sri Lanka, and what happened in the restaurants and foyers of hotels in which I myself have stayed in Colombo last weekend was utterly devastating, utterly heartbreaking, but it was also extremely eye-opening. And we, none of us, can afford to ignore this new development. You'll have heard me talk after every atrocity, especially in the time I've been on radio, about the character, the nature of these suicide bombers, these mass murderers, these Islamist fanatics. You'll have heard me talk about how an extraordinary number of them are ex-jailbirds, ex-convicts, drinkers of alcohol, imbibers of drugs, users of prostitutes, people who live in the demi-monde in Brussels, in Paris, and elsewhere. You'll have heard me talk about the apparent paradox of petty criminals coming out of jail and becoming so fanaticized in the name of religion that they are ready to incinerate themselves as well as many others as they can. But that was all turned on its head in Sri Lanka, because it turns out that the people involved in the heinous mass slaughter of the innocents in Sri Lanka were rich people who didn't take drugs, who didn't drink alcohol, who didn't live in the demi-monde. They lived in multi-million-pound houses in Colombo. They were all highly educated, upper class, not middle class, upper class Sri Lankans. The type of people I know and have met many times in Sri Lanka and also in London. They were multi-millionaire owners of factories and businesses. And they strapped explosives on their back and sent themselves to hell and sent hundreds of entirely innocent people to their deaths. This is a new development and a very, very worrying one. Because no matter how good your police force is, you wouldn't be looking in the Chamber of Commerce. You wouldn't be looking at the Rotary Club. You wouldn't be looking at the long list of alumni of top international universities for your next suicide bombers. Actually, the wife of the lead suicide bomber, pregnant wife, blew herself, her 3 children and her unborn child up when the police came to raid her house in the aftermath of this atrocity. It's a very new and a very, very dangerous development. Speaking of which, 37 people beheaded in a single day in Saudi Arabia, our good chums, our best friends in the Muslim world. Repulsive, said little Alan Duncan, the British Foreign Office Minister. Repulsive, he said. Strong word, but not so repulsive we're going to stop selling them weapons with which they're massacring innocents, just like the innocents in Sri Lanka, on a daily basis in Yemen, where year after year now, the mass slaughter of innocents is going ahead with full British, American and French collaboration. Not only that, but in Yemen they're not just suffering incessant aerial bombardment, they've actually now got a problem of an unmanageable stream of refugees, immigrants coming from Ethiopia into Yemen. Imagine how bad things must be in Yemen, in Ethiopia rather, if the people are fleeing from Ethiopia into Yemen, where famine stalks the land, man-made, and where aerial death can and does come at any moment. And we'll be talking about the brand new development of the British and Irish governments stepping in and demanding that talks begin on re-establishing devolved democracy as provided for in the Good Friday Agreement in the northeast of Ireland. We'll be talking about that, and we'll be talking about China. And here's a treat. We'll be asking Adam. For the last hour or more, you can ask Adam, the cleverest man in all of England, any question that you like. It's going to be the mother of all talk shows, and you're welcome to it. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You call us, we call you back. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. That's 0344 499 1000. You can tweet at George Galloway, at Talk Radio. You can email through the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text the word talk followed by your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal charges. Now, there is no greater expert in this aisle than my first guest this evening. Abdel Bari Atwan is described by some, certainly by me, as the last Arab, by which we mean the finest, the greatest. He's certainly the greatest Arab journalist. He's the only one, actually. He's the only one who's not bought and paid for by one regime or another. He's a truly independent man, and that's why I'm always happy to talk to him. Abdel Bari, thank you for joining us.
George, it is my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, I want to start off with what happened in Saudi Arabia this week. When ISIS cut people's heads off and crucify them and hang their bodies in public, everyone is, of course, repulsed. And even when Saudi Arabia did it this week, the minister, Alan Duncan, said it was a repulsive act. But it hasn't changed, it would appear, Britain's relationship to Saudi Arabia. Why did Saudi Arabia do such a repulsive thing?
First, I'm surprised because money talks here, George. And I'm really shocked with the silence of the so-called free world when Saudi Arabia executed 37 people. Some of them actually, when they were arrested, they were children. So I'm surprised why this silence. Second, I believe the Saudi realized that the Arab Spring or the second wave of the Arab Spring are moving toward them. So they would like to terrorize the people. And by this execution, 37 at one go, about 32 of them are from the Shia sect. They would like to send a message to the Saudi public, to the Saudi people, that we will not tolerate any protest, any demand for political reforms, any demand for freedom, any demand actually for human rights. So I think it was this reason, and the Saudi actually, they know nobody can criticize them, especially in the West. They know President Trump will be on their side. He is protecting them. He is using the veto against the Congress when they actually wanted America to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. So that's why they are doing this, George.
Now, the bones of contention, if you'll forgive the pun, grow and grow, don't they, between civilized opinion around the world and the Saudi regime. There was the cutting into pieces of our colleague, Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist of note in the Arab world, a citizen or a resident rather of the United States, murdered in a Saudi embassy, cut into pieces. That caused a real crisis for a time, but would appear to have been forgotten. And then there's the bones of all these women and children that are piling up in Yemen. And I don't know if you're across the story. I was on RT France last night and touched on it again this evening. The government of Mr. President Macron has demanded that senior French journalists appear in front of the intelligence services of France for revealing a document detailing the French involvement in the massacres in Yemen. And Britain, of course, has already faced that issue because everybody knows British arms and experts, let's call them, even some mercenaries, are engaged in Yemen. Now, the US was so shocked by the Khashoggi affair that they demanded an end to the war in Yemen and peace talks. They even named the place where the peace talks were going to take place. But that too, just like the Khashoggi affair, appears to have died a death.
It is honestly a very, very depressing situation. A colleague of us were actually detained, dismembered, slain, and actually his body was melted by acid on the consul of Saudi Arabia house. And until now, nobody is actually raising a finger. The story died completely on the media. Nobody is asking for international investigation about this crime. Even the media people were supposed to be standing with their colleague and to raise their voice in order to prevent anything like this to be repeated. They are absolutely silent, and nobody cares. No international investigation at all. No United Nations. So this is one thing. Second thing, when we talk about British government, Theresa May arms deal to Yemen, to Saudi Arabia, which is involved in Yemen, it seems it is all right. As long as you have money, you can buy weapons, you can buy equipment. It is fine. Go and kill. The most important thing for the government of Britain is actually to sell arms. And regardless where this arm is going to be used, is it going to be used against innocent people in Yemen? 5 years of bombardment, 5 years of starvation, 5 years of actually killing children, about attacking or bombing wedding parties,
weddings, funerals, school buses.
Parties. Yes. So it is very depressing, honestly, George. I don't know. I remember, honestly, when I first came to this world 40 years ago, when I came to London, I really, the values of this country was very strong. We used to talk, we used actually to criticize, and we used to find public opinion, which is siding with us. Now it seems the government silencing everybody. The media changed completely. Honestly, I feel very depressed.
Well, don't be so depressed that you go quiet, because if you go quiet, I'm afraid a state of total silence in the Arab media will obtain. Abdel Bari Atwan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Our second guest is Dr. Tara McCormack. She's the foreign policy expert and lecturer in international relations at Leicester University. Dr. McCormack, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, I was just talking to Abdel Bari Atwan about the situation in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen and the aftermath of the murder and dismemberment and melting of the corpse of our friend Jamal Khashoggi. It got quite emotional, actually. You're an expert, an academic. How do you see these events? How do you think they rationalize the execution of 37 people by beheading and crucifixion in a single day, whilst sending their foreign minister to London for a red carpet welcome?
Just say, I'd call myself a lecturer in international politics. I don't know I'd give myself such high compliments as an expert in foreign policy. But I guess my point would really be about Britain's approach to Saudi Arabia or other states rather than dissecting Saudi Arabia itself, which I'm not an expert on internal Saudi politics. And I guess what's kind of important to point out is that, our relations with other states, a state such as Saudi Arabia, is not based on that state's foreign policy or indeed their internal human rights records. And I think that's kind of the, thing that needs to be.
Well, it is in some
plainly.
places, though, Doctor. We have unrecognised the government of Venezuela, frozen its gold, recognised someone else entirely. So, if you forgive me saying so, that's not really true, is it?
Well, no, but my point is that Britain bases its foreign policy on its perceived interests. Okay, now whether that's material, for example, weapons, or geopolitical, our allies in the region. Obviously, we think of Israel and Saudi as our kind of gendarme in the Middle East. We sell plenty of arms to Saudi. So essentially, our relations with other states are based on a very straightforward, realpolitik assessment of interest. And, we can have a debate about what our interests are and so on.
Well, that would be...
But the thing is, we in Britain, America, France, Australia, Germany, we pretend that our relations with states are not this, and that they are actually
values-based. We pretend they're values-based.
Absolutely. Now, this is obviously nonsense on stilts. It is well known we protect, we support police and arm and protect in the UN some of the most brutal regimes on earth. We all know this, and it's apparent to sort of every thinking person, apart from perhaps, the editorial writers of the Times and so on. And we could look very recently when there was the attempt to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela, the American-backed coup, sort of attempted coup. And of course, we in Britain, the British government, got right behind this, and we were denouncing Maduro as dictator and talking about human rights in Venezuela. And at the same time, I really had to laugh. The Foreign Office was tweeting pictures of a sort of women's empowerment workshop in the British Embassy in Cairo. And, of course, we know the current military regime in Egypt is committing mass human rights violations and so on. So I guess the thing about that, for me, is the problem with British foreign policy is not so much the realpolitik aspect of it, because I think we can have a legitimate debate about that, but that, we very straightforwardly have an extremely hypocritical approach to foreign policy, in that we
it would be
pretend.
If it was entirely a realpolitik foreign policy, that would be palatable if there was not so much hypocrisy involved.
And we can have a debate about that, in the same way that, say, Russia, China, Saudi, for example, have a fairly straightforward realpolitik foreign policy. And again, one can disagree, agree, debate it. But, of course, the ludicrous thing about Britain and America, France, Germany is that we just straightforwardly conduct an extremely hypocritical policy whereby we say, of course, we support international law, ethics, the responsibility to protect and so on, but it is straightforwardly apparent that we mean different things by that, depending upon which state we're talking about.
Indeed. And the problem, if there's a problem, is that we live in a democracy and we elect our governments. And if, as you said, and I agree with you, every thinking person knows that our foreign policy is utterly amoral at best and immoral at worst, eventually voters might begin to think, well, actually, we don't want our country acting in this way. We would prefer our country to be a force for more good. Dare I mention it, because it got Robin Cook into a lot of trouble, that we want an ethical foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a far more complicated question, and I don't have any answer to that, because one of the really interesting things is that publics, for example, in Britain, for example, in America, have a very different approach to foreign policy, as do the political elites. Now, successive American presidents have actually been elected on arguing for a less interventionary foreign policy. Obama, Trump. Now, that hasn't happened for various reasons, so we can call it the blob. There's a big discussion about that. We also see in the UK, for example, last April, when the British government with Britain and France bombed Syria, there was about a week of really frenetic activity. Now, there were several polls which showed that the vast majority of the British people did not want Britain to bomb Syria, whatever the truth of the chemical attack. So that people were quite straightforward. Even if the Syrian government had done it, they did not want to bomb Syria. So that is actually a really more complicated question about how do we change things in Britain so that our political elites, and this is so for the states as well, actually reflect, the democratic wishes of actually most people in Britain who do not want to engage in military intervention. I mean, certainly people want to send aid and so on, but actually consistently the British public is far less hawkish and belligerent than the British political elites. And that, I think, is a real problem that we have.
Well, quite so in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, even before we knew what we know now. Absolutely. There was a majority of people in Britain against the attack.
Absolutely, but the problem is that does not then, that our MPs again do not reflect the British public when it comes to foreign policy. So, as we know, huge demonstrations against the war in Iraq, but the majority of MPs, albeit with a substantial minority, voted for the war. Now, we know in last April, Theresa May actually refused to recall Parliament in order to vote on the airstrikes, and no doubt she was slightly alarmed because of these polls showing that people actually did not want to. Okay, so that that really is an issue, I think, for the future. How do we in Britain, in America, how do voters, make our foreign policy? How do we democratize our foreign policy? How do we make it? How do we make it?
I think you should teach a course on that, Doctor. It's particularly a problem for the political class in relation to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia doesn't have a lot going for it. Their extremist take on Islamic theology and practice is not actually an attractive one. to many Muslims, never mind many non-Muslims. The sight of the foreign minister in Downing Street striding in with the blood of 37 executed people still fresh, metaphorically, on their hands, it's not a good look. It's not like there's a lot of love out there for Saudi Arabia and what it represents. And even the minister, Alan Duncan, in very powerful words, described the events this week as repulsive. It's very difficult for the rulers to keep their steady-as-she-goes policy towards Saudi Arabia, yet they show no signs of seeking to abandon it.
Yeah, I mean, Saudi Arabia is considered to be our ally, as I said earlier, sort of gendarme in the Middle East, along with Israel. It is also a huge market for our arms, which unfortunately form a very large part of British exports, but, also too of European arms market and so on. So, I don't see that our relationship will change at any time soon.
Dr. Tara McCormack, thank you for giving us your time on a Friday night. Foreign policy expert, I insist, and lecturer in international relations at Leicester University. Now, I'm obliged to say the following. The doctor mentioned the editorial in the Times, but we want to make clear other papers have had the same editorial direction at times, and it is not restricted only to the Times. Now, as you know, they're not my words. If they were, they'd have been better written, but I'm obliged to utter them. We'll be right back. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You ring us, we'll call you back when it's time, and therefore it needn't cost you more than a penny or two. You can tweet me, of course, at Talk Radio, at George Galloway. Don't forget to at both of us. Now, as I said at the beginning of the show, not only are the people in Yemen suffering hunger, even famine, the return of dreaded disease, pestilence, and the ever-present danger of being bombed from the air, and some spectacularly grotesque examples, weddings, funerals, school buses, schools, hospitals, clinics, and so on, being bombed from the air, the most sophisticated weaponry, the most sophisticated warplanes, and so on. Not only is all that happening for 5 whole years to the people of Yemen, they now have, on top of all of that, refugees, immigrants, it's not clear which, both probably, are arriving in Yemen from Ethiopia. And humanitarian organizations, charities and international aid agencies and various other organizations are struggling to help the Yemeni people cope. Our next guest is Olivia Heedon from the International Organization for Immigration, and she's on the ground in Yemen, and I'm very grateful to her for joining us. Olivia, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first of all, how bad can things be in Ethiopia if people are fleeing to the Yemen?
So I think a big part of this is to understand that Yemen isn't necessarily the destination that most of these Ethiopian migrants want to get to. For some, like a smaller amount, sure, it might be, but most dream of making it to other Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia or some of its neighbors. Typically, when I've spoken to people, not just here, but maybe also in Djibouti, who are about to cross to Yemen, what they've told me is that they know maybe one person who's sort of made it in Saudi and has been able to build their mum a house and send money home so their younger brothers and sisters can go to school. So it's sort of this dream of opportunity that most of these people are chasing. And not just opportunity, but also just survival. Because a lot of them are coming from rural communities or poor communities in cities, and there isn't much for them there.
Now, the Yemen authorities, such as they are, there are, of course, at least two states operating inside Yemen, and neither with a very secure hold even on the areas they control, can't possibly cope with, on top of everything else, this stream of immigrants. Where are they arriving, and what's happening to them when they arrive?
So most are arriving via boat. Typically, they start their journey at home in Ethiopia, although we do see some people from Somalia as well. And they make their way to Djibouti, usually by bus and also by foot, which is crazy because it's so hot. And they have so little. Some people don't even really have shoes, or they're walking in flip-flops. And then from Djibouti, they take a boat to somewhere along the Yemeni coast. There's a few different sort of hotspots where people arrive. And then once they arrive, like normally they might be meeting, because they've paid smugglers along the way. So normally once they get to Yemen, they might meet their next sort of person in the smuggling network to bring them to the next part of the journey, which is up towards the Saudi border. We have a patrolling team along the Yemeni coast who have medical staff and other types of humanitarian aid workers who try and meet these migrants to give them food, water, medical support, and any other type of assistance. And we also offer to help them get home if they really want to return. Otherwise, most of them continue on their journey. Now,
from what I know of the regime in Saudi Arabia, virtually none of them have a chance of getting into Saudi Arabia, and if they did, only in conditions of clandestinity, and with the danger of severe punishment if caught. They presumably have this one person in their mind that made it and built their mum a house. How many do you think are making it? What percentage?
In terms of how many people actually make it into Saudi or other Gulf countries, we're not so sure. We don't have data on that. Although last year, around 100, 150 people entered Yemen, and we assume that a lot of them made their way sort of north towards Saudi. And this year it seems to be like more arriving, although we couldn't necessarily say that it's a lot more yet. And then of the people who actually make it, you know, it doesn't take that much to make it, to be honest. Even if you work as like a groundskeeper, you know, watering the lawns of some person's house, that's probably enough to be able to afford certain things that help your family survive or improve their lives back in places like Ethiopia or other countries. So we don't necessarily have data on the exact figures, but a lot of the people do make it across. I think one thing that's important to note is that, yes, they have to cross irregularly or clandestinely, as you said, but it doesn't have to be this way. If we had more safe and legal pathways, then situations like we have to hear today in Aden wouldn't happen. More lives would be saved, and the situation just would be better, not just for migrants, but communities, like society as a whole, because society actually relies a lot on migrants. If you were just to go poof and they were gone one day, so many things would just not happen.
I'm not sure the Saudi authorities see it that way, though.
Yes, it's possible. I think that what we have to do is just remind ourselves of who is the person who's our housekeeper, who is the person who is taking care of our gardens, who is the person who's serving us food at lunch. And when we look at all of these people and look at what their background is and where they come from, we'll see like a complete story of migration from multiple places.
So what's it like on the ground for you? Talk us through how many people are there? How many bombing raids are happening? What's the food situation for the people in Yemen, never mind arrivals? Talk us through some of the colour of that, would you?
Sure. So in terms of the migrant situation, of the people who've been rounded up here in Aden and Laj, which are two sort of governorates beside each other, it's about 2,000 to 3,000 people. So in one location where we were today, it's this big disused sports complex, and the men are being kept inside, and it's the vast majority are men, are being kept inside a gym. That's definitely have the effects of the conflict felt in it. All the windows are shattered. It's basically a shell of a building. And then the women are kept separately in another room that's pretty much just as bad. So those conditions are abhorrent and deplorable. And also getting food to those people is difficult because we're trying to now scramble to assist these migrants in something that was unexpected. And now we're trying to get resources together to provide for that. Then on the other side of things, you have this massive conflict going on, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, 3.6 million people displaced, and vast parts of the country are completely food insecure. I mean, as humanitarians, this is a difficult country to respond in. One, because of the ongoing conflict, obviously. I'm not normally based in Aden. I normally am based in Sana'a. And since I've been in the country, which is probably like 6 weeks, there's been 3 or 4 airstrikes on the city. And that's just one city. Then, as one of the main groups that we work to support are internally displaced Yemenis. So those are people who were living in areas that became too dangerous to stay in because of the war, which is massive parts of the country. So they've moved to sort of small settlements. So here in Yemen is different from maybe South Sudan or other places where there's massive conflict, where they have these big sort of displacement camps, refugee camps. Here it's like small settlements that are dispersed. So it makes it harder to get the assistance to the people, especially because they live in remote areas. And so much of the country is insecure and dangerous for us as humanitarians to go to.
And how is your work funded, Doctor?
So we're funded by mostly by governmental by governments. We're funded by DFID, which is the UK from.
I think we're losing your line, Olivia. Thank you very much indeed for providing really quite a stark picture of what life is like on the ground in Yemen, and with its additional problem now of significant numbers of people entering the country as a stepping stone to head for the country that's waging the war on Yemen in the first place. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. Don't forget that in the last hour you can ask Adam, the cleverest man in England. So get your questions ready, fire them in. Christina on Twitter says Britain keeps quiet about the wrongs going on in France, Saudi, America and other countries who they consider to be their allies, yet speaks loudly about wrongs in countries that have different ideologies from Britain, who do not kowtow to Britain. And Shine and Rise says authority is not the truth, truth is the authority. And Ryan says a voting split among Tories and Brexit Party giving Labour a lead, with an anger to austerity and public desire for utility renationalisation. I feel if Labour backed the Leave vote unequivocally, this and their policies would easily win the next general election. And Patrick Vidine says, yes, the UK is still doing business with Saudi Arabia's regime. I don't really care if we lose GDP, and neither should my government. If this kind of injustice and corruption continues much longer, the people will need to remove Parliament. And David Leviscont says, if every cost to do with the military was frozen for 1 month, what could the world achieve to help people as opposed to killing them? And Terry Eaton says, brilliant opening, George. You are correct that the left in Britain should be supporting the French people in their quest. I believe that the EU is crumbling country by country, and any action that speeds up its demise is the way forward. Patrick says, instead of spending trillions of dollars on making bombs and weapons, why not build agricultural and water facilities, schools, hospitals, etc.? And John Guess says, George, do you think that if the USA can divert Venezuela to client state status, the US will start to retreat from the Middle East, as they will have gained control of oil reserves vastly greater than the Middle East? And Tad says Thatcher's stalking horse was Sir Anthony Mayer. That's M-E-Y-E-R, not M-A-R-E. That's from Tad. I remember it well. I was taking tea in the residence of Her Majesty's ambassador to Sri Lanka and listening to the BBC News. I can't remember his name now, but his grandfather was a prime minister. I will remember it, a Liberal prime minister in the early part of the 20th century. And as we were sitting there taking tea, on the BBC News came the news that this Sir Anthony Mayer, and I sat in Parliament with him but could hardly place him, was now running to become Prime Minister of Britain. And of course, he did change the course of history, because his challenge to Mrs. Thatcher was the beginning of the end. In the second hour, we'll be talking about Ireland and the démarche made by the British and Irish governments today. We'll be talking about Brexit stockpiling, and we'll be talking with Adam and with the academic that we spoke to last week, quite controversially as it turned out, about China. And in the last hour, you can ask Adam anything you like. I'm George Galloway. This is the mother of all talk shows. This is Talk Radio. 0344 499 1000. You call us, we call you back. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. Or you can tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Or you can email me through the website at talkradio.co.uk. Or you can text the word talk followed by your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. Now, in the wake of the foul murder of a young journalist in Derry last Friday, I think it was Friday, we dealt with it here on this show, as you may recall, and particularly in the light of what happened at her funeral when the priest made such a powerful statement that it was a pity that it had taken the death of this young woman to bring the elected political leaders in the north of Ireland together. In the light of all of that, the British and Irish governments have just a few hours ago announced that they are going to attempt to kickstart the long frozen political process in the north of Ireland. Now, John Tong knows everything about these matters. He's an Irish politics professor at the University of Liverpool, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. John, especially when Liverpool are playing live on the television, it's particularly noble of you to come on the show. Thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
Now, this came out of the blue a little bit, didn't it? Tell us.
Yeah, I mean, the talks process, obviously the pressure increased enormously, given the words of Father McGill at Lyra McKee's funeral the other day, because frankly, there hadn't been a talks process for months. Everything had collapsed. Stormont collapsed more than 2 years ago. There'd nearly been a deal between the parties only a few months ago. But frankly, there was no sign whatsoever of any resumption of Stormont. And the people, the MLAs, the Northern Ireland Assembly members that I spoke to recently, frankly, before the murder of Lyra McKee, felt that there was no chance of Stormont coming back any time this year. So in that sense, this talks process has come out of the blue. It's also come at a difficult time because we're heading into local elections. There'll probably be European Parliament elections. People tend to go back into their DUP and Sinn Féin tribes, if you want to call them that. So it's probably not a favourable time, frankly, to be having talks. But if not now, then when?
It presumably has something to do with, I wasn't there, but I'm often there, with a sense amongst the public that something must be done, and that the death of this young journalist, Lara McKee, should not be entirely in vain, that something good should come out of something so horrific.
Absolutely. And there's also a huge sense of frustration at the fact that you've got 90 Northern Ireland Assembly members being paid most of their salary for, frankly, not that much. You know, Stormont collapsed in January 2017. These people have not been back to work since. Yes, I know they're still doing some constituency duties, but they're not doing much else. And I think the emotion associated with the Lara McKee killing has meant that really the politicians couldn't evade their responsibilities. There had to be some sort of resumption of the talks process. But let's not be overly optimistic about what this process can bring, because we've had numerous false dawns before, and there is a wider question whether Stormont or whether Northern Ireland, full stop, can ever fully be a functioning entity. The issues that divide the two sides at the moment are, in some respects, small beer compared to the divisions that were there at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, when you were dealing with these major issues of decommissioning, of policing change. Now, if you look at the issues that divide them, they're about an Irish Language Act, they're about same-sex marriage, they're about dealing with the past. They're not of the same import as those issues of 1998, but they still have the propensity to collapse Stormont. They still have the propensity to prevent a restoration of Stormont, because these issues of cultural identity are so dearly held. An Irish Language Act, if you look at Unionist public opinion, 90% of Unionists don't want an Irish Language Act. Look at nationalist opinion, and around 90+% of nationalists do want an Irish Language Act. Same-sex marriage, the DUP has voted it down 5 times where the Assembly was sitting. Sinn Féin want same-sex marriage. And then the issue of dealing with the past, where the DUP think there's an unfair focus upon what British soldiers did during the conflict, whereas Sinn Féin say, look, thousands of IRA personnel went to jail, very few British soldiers did, and there has to be justice for all. So those divisions, that they can't be wished away, and no amount of emotion that is clearly there after the Lara McKee murder, no amount of emotion can wash away continuing divisions between the two communities.
Is there a bit of grandstanding maybe then in London and Dublin, the Irish and British governments showing that they at least are responding to the demand that something must be done?
Yeah, I mean, if those people had not been embarrassed in the church the other day at the funeral and not been forced to their feet, would we actually have had the talks process that has been announced today? I think that's a question that they really need to answer. The fact that the rest of the congregation rose to their feet in frustration and also applause at the priest's comments meant that they were, in effect, those politicians at the front, were shamed into launching a talks process today. It'd be interesting to see whether those politicians really believe that this can work. It needs to work, and it needs to work quickly, because, I mean, there's supposed to be a review of it in May. Then you get into the marching season with the controversies associated with Orange Order parades throughout July in particular. So that's not a good time to be trying to restore Stormont at all. And I still think there's probably a lack of political will amongst the parties to go back into Stormont. Yes, all the parties say we need to restore the political institutions, but it's invariably on their terms. And I think, even if Stormont was restored, and I'm fairly pessimistic it will it ever be stable? There's been relatively few periods. We talk about the Chuckle Brothers, when that brief honeymoon period when Paisley and McGuinness had a good working relationship. There were a few years of relative stability after that. But really, a lot of the time, it's been a battle per day between the major parties at Stormont. I think it's inherently an unstable institution. But the alternatives, joint authority, would the two communities accept joint authority between the British and Irish governments, or a united Ireland, which, longer term may well happen, but isn't going to happen tomorrow. The other options are probably, at the moment, equally unfeasible, at least in the short term.
So most likely, they'll go through the motions through the election season. then through the marching season. I suppose the fear is, you can tell me if you think it's a realistic one, that in this vacuum, breakaway splinters, extremists, new this and continuity that, that they may continue to garner strength, notwithstanding the tremendous popular backlash against what happened in Derry.
I think the dissident Republicans will try and continue their activities regardless of whether Stormont is functional. I think we need to be careful about associating dissident Republican activity simply with the political vacuum. The dissidents killed 29 people at Omagh 4 months after the Good Friday Agreement. It slightly irritates me when I hear that the Good Friday Agreement brought peace to Northern Ireland. It brought a relative peace. And we should remember, the families of the victims of people at Omagh, and there's been 158 people killed due to the security situation since the Good Friday Agreement. That's not to say the Good Friday Agreement hasn't greatly improved things in Northern Ireland. Palpably it has. It's hugely contributed to a reduction in the death toll and in the level of violence, but it hasn't eradicated violence. Dissidents, they will try and carry on their activities, but only have a low level of traction within Republican communities where Sinn Féin dominate, not them. Dissidents will try and continue their activities, whether Stormont is sitting or otherwise. Dissidents will try and continue their activities regardless of whether Brexit takes place. Brexit is only functional in the sense that it's revived a focus and interest on the border in the island of Ireland. But if you actually look at the death toll since the Good Friday Agreement, there's been more deaths when Stormont has been sitting than when it hasn't been sitting. So we need to avoid easy conclusions that you get the political institutions up and running and that's dissidents will simply wither away. The dissidents will always be there, but I think they're in one sense containable. That might seem an absurd thing to say, given that the death of poor Lyra McKee recently, but the dissidents have struggled to gain traction in Republican communities. Most people have rejected them, and I think that will continue to be the case, probably in perpetuity.
Now, finally. Is Sinn Féin campaigning on a border poll in these elections? Because that's provided for, of course, in the Good Friday Agreement, and would, I declare an interest, as someone of Irish Catholic background, that would solve many problems, create others, of course, but if the majority of people in the north of Ireland want to remain in the EU, there's a very easy way of doing so, and that would be to vote in a border poll to reunite the island.
Absolutely. And there is growing evidence that given the changing demographics of Northern Ireland and given the unrest over Brexit, that a border poll could be quite close. And that's not something that probably would have been said only a few years ago. And in the event of a hard Brexit, the survey evidence suggests that it will be very tight referendum on the border. It doesn't look like the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland is prepared to concede a border poll. The Shadow Secretary of State, Tony Lloyd, told Sinn Féin's fringe meeting at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool only a few months ago that they weren't having a border poll. A border poll is only the Secretary of State's gift, so the Secretary of State seems very reluctant to concede a border poll. Sinn Féin say that they do want one. There are obviously risks for Sinn Féin because what happens if the border poll is lost, that in other words there's not a vote for a united Ireland, there can't be another one for another 7 years. So in one sense it could put back the cause of a united Ireland. So the moment has to be seized, but it has to be the right moment if Sinn Féin are going to advance the cause of Irish unity via a border poll. But a border poll is probably at least now possibly winnable for Sinn Féin, at least in the next decade or so, perhaps more, in a way that it wasn't even conceivably winnable only a few years ago.
That must be a different Tony Lloyd to the one I sat with in Parliament for decades. Thanks very much, John Tong, Irish politics professor at the University of Liverpool, for joining us on not just a Friday night, but this Friday night. I am English and proud of it, says the Twitter handle I'm looking at. I am English and proud of it. And he says, I think it's a he, listening for the first time to Galloway on Talk Radio, fantastic, informative, and as usual, George speaks total sense with gusto and clarity. I'm Grateful indeed to you, sir, for that. Patrick Vidine says, you are a brave soul, Olivia Heaton, to be trying to help these ultra-poor people in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Yemen, etc. Amen to that. Now, whether or not we Brexit, when we Brexit, is of course still open to question in the courts, in the ballot boxes, in the parliament and elsewhere amongst the public. But one thing that's definitely happening is stockpiling. It turns out that we are stockpiling as if there was going to be a real need for stockpiling, which is good news for those who can rent out warehouse space, good news for the freight industry, and that's not to be sneezed at. Pauline Bastidon is in Brussels. She's the head of global and European policy at the Freight Transport Association, and she's kindly agreed to join us this evening. Pauline, thank you for that.
Thank you.
What's the stockpiling about? What are we stockpiling? How much of it? And what are the implications of that? After all, we'll soon be stockpiling for Christmas. If we're stockpiling for Brexit and Christmas at the same time, that's a lot of stock.
That's a real issue, indeed. And, you know, the mission of the logistics industry is to ensure that the goods reach their destination. And they will do everything they can to make sure that this is the case. We've been warned by government, we've been warned by the French government as well and others, that there's a risk of serious disruptions if there's a no deal. And this is very real, you know. So we could see potential disruptions to supply chains and problems in getting goods across the border. So yes, stockpiling is one of the things that companies are looking at. They're not starting to stockpile now for October. They will start later, obviously. But one of the big challenges they face is that October is usually the time, September, October is usually the time when they start preparing for Christmas. And obviously, warehousing space is limited in the UK, so, you know, stockpiling in relation to Brexit will have to compete with stockpiling in relation to Christmas.
Well, I've just instructed my friends to get out and start a warehouse company, but the reality is we can't, on current capacity, stockpile for both. Maybe we'll have to cancel Brexit or cancel Christmas. I'm not sure which. What do you think?
Well, hopefully nothing will have to be cancelled. Christmas will not have to be cancelled, and certainly logistics will do everything it can to make sure that supply chains run as efficiently as possible and that people have the goods that they need to have a good Christmas. But for sure it's going to be a big challenge. And in addition to that, you've got the prospect of significant costs, red tape. Many companies have to recruit additional workforce potentially or sign new contracts with intermediaries to help them with their customs formalities. This is just one example, but it's not something to take lightly. It's not something that you can just, click your fingers and then it's done at the last minute. You need to have advance notice of the changes. You need to know when it's going to happen. And, well, at the moment, as you said, we don't really know when it's going to happen or exactly what form it's going to take.
Quite. Is this not a bit of the project fear, Pauline? After all, there is no objective reason why us leaving a trading bloc needs to lead to gigantic logjams and therefore the need for stockpiling. Is this not a bit of propaganda, really?
Well, I don't know. You tell my members who are stuck for, in some cases, several days.
No, you've got to prepare for the worst.
Some strike in France, just a few weeks, months ago, when their drivers were stuck there for hours on end. Believe me, they didn't think it was Project Fear at that point. Now, various things can create disruptions. Brexit is certainly not isolated. No deal is not isolated in creating potential disruptions. But what companies have to do in order to be responsible is plan for all eventualities. Because the people who tell them this is Project Fear now are going to turn around and blame them if goods are not coming as they should.
No, I understand that, but a strike is an action by people, a deliberate action to cause disruption. So in a way, your analogy kind of made my point. It would be an action for political purpose to cause tremendous disruption in the event of us leaving without a deal. It's only an interim deal in any case, isn't it? Because we then spend the next couple of years actually working out the modalities of future relations.
You're right that the transition is not going to be forever. The transition would be limited in time, and, well, the prospect of disruptions at the end of it would still be there.
Yes.
But it would be a different atmosphere to negotiate with the EU.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's...
But, I mean, for example, your members, Pauline, your members are taking goods, for example, across the Swiss EU border.
Yes,
of course, there are some delays, but it's not, World War III.
Switzerland is not like a no-deal Brexit would be. Not at all. For instance, Switzerland is in the same security zone as the EU. There's a lot of regulatory alignment. You don't need checks on agri-food products. Switzerland is paradise, frankly, in terms of, frictionless trade and so on, which is not something we would get under a no-deal situation. Now, logistics can adapt to lots of things. Companies will adapt to lots of things. They might not like everything, but they will adapt, that's for sure. But they need clarity and they need advance notice. And, it's like having to do a tax return and being told, well, we don't know when it's going to be due, and we'll tell you how to do it maybe 3 weeks before it's due.
Now, that's a nightmare scenario. Tell me, what kind of things are being stockpiled or will be shortly be being stockpiled?
So the kind of things that will be stockpiled are things that can remain there for a little while without going bad.
Not non-perishable things.
Exactly. So you wouldn't have. There are certain medicines that you can't really stockpile. There are certain food products that you can't really stockpile because it has to be fresh. But there are things that have a shelf life which is a lot longer. So one thing, for instance, that has been stockpiled already in provision for a March no deal was apples. Lots of apples were stored in the UK. We've had that with clothes. We've had that with various kind of things. Anything you can think of, really, that would come from abroad. Because, well...
We used to grow a lot of apples ourselves, Pauline. I'm not sure when we became dependent on apples from the European mainland. It's an extraordinary thing.
That's an example I was given recently.
No, you're right.
Yes, apparently
you're
now
right.
there are lots and lots of apples, because, of course, this is one example of industry being forced to do that sort of thing just to be, on the safe side.
To be prudent, yeah, of course, I understand.
And it's been a waste to some extent, because what do you do with all these stocks once you don't need it anymore?
That's a gamble that nobody can afford to take, but it is a gamble because if there is an agreement, then all the stockpiling and some of the waste will have been unnecessary. That's why, forgive me if I sounded sceptical, I honestly do feel that there's a good deal of propaganda and fear-mongering has gone into this entire business. But I appreciate absolutely your members have to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, haven't I? Right?
That's exactly what we tell them to do. And, there's nothing else they can do, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as I said, they are responsible for making sure the goods arrive in time and, in good condition and everything. So people rely on them to do that. And so that's what they will be doing.
Well, I'm preparing. I'm eating now only English apples and English and Welsh cheese and so on. Because I feel sure we'll pull through. Pauline, thank you very much for joining us. Pauline Bastidon of the Freight Transport Association. Let me take a quick break. My old friend in Scotland, Marie McFarlane, says the Gilets jaunes have spread to many other areas in France as we approach week 24. Predictably, the poorer areas have a heavy police presence. I also noticed plenty of anti-EU banners, so this may be a crucial omission from the mainstream media. And Ford says, I don't know much about Northern Ireland politics, but maybe the people of Northern Ireland should start thinking about voting for totally new parties. Other parties are available. We mustn't contravene the election rules. One man who does know a lot about Irish politics, he's even stood in previous elections in Irish politics, is our regular listener and correspondent, Fra in Belfast. Go ahead, Fra.
Good evening, George. How are you?
Yes, by the grace of God, I'm good, thank you. What did you make of the British government's démarche and the Dublin government, for that matter?
Yes, well, obviously, as an independent political activist and someone who's capable of independent political thought, George, I have to say I am not in favour of a return to the devolved assembly at Stormont, because we've had 21 years of the peace process. We've had 21 years, really, of copper fastening the lack of violence in society. And I know, obviously, we're going to go back to the events of towards last weekend. But what I've witnessed in all those years is just, scandal after scandal, ineptitude or potential corruption from what we've had up in Stormont. We've had the NAMA crisis, we've had Red Sky, we've had RHI, we've had double jobbing, we've had people expenses scandals, we've had people employing families, and I just personally look at Stormont.
Sounds rather like politics at Westminster, Fra.
Yes, absolutely, George, and that's part of the issue that I have with this whole thing. It's the system itself that's managing our state of affairs. We're told we're living in democracy. I personally think it's an illusion. I know we have the vote, we have the power within ourselves to change those who represent us every 4 years in the council and every 5 years in Parliament. But all we're doing is changing the faces that are running the machinery that is governing us. We're not really changing the system itself, which leads to all the things I've just mentioned, the potential corruption, the scandals, the nepotism within politics. I personally, as someone who sees themselves as a socialist, and as such, then I would have the politics of republicanism. I would prefer to see direct rule so that we don't have these continuous scandals and inept government at Stormont, where what you have are two political parties tied together like two racehorses, but constantly pulling in two different directions. I would have direct rule followed by, and echoing what you've said, a border poll and a national reunification referendum, because I believe that's the only way to eventually resolve the national question and the continued kind of hiatus in Irish politics.
Well, that's not an uncontested process, of course. Here's a tweet from Pips Da. Irish unity, why? The only people to benefit are those who support division. Never seen a Protestant-only school, have you? Don't believe so. So there you go. You've still got quite entrenched opposition to that, even expressed not entirely clearly. I'm not sure why it would support division to reunify the country. But Pips Da is right in the sense that this is by no means an uncontested idea.
Yes, sure, you're absolutely right. There are two sides to this equation, two sides to every story, and two opposing political agendas and outlooks. But for my reality, I see partition as something that was forced upon the Irish people without a referendum, without a Good Friday type agreement, where the people of Ireland voted or acquiesced in any way to the partition of what I see as my country. So as such, I think partition was an injustice forced upon the Irish people at the point of British guns. And the Good Friday Agreement, which I voted for, George, a lot of people who voted for the Good Friday Agreement, like myself, I didn't vote for Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution to be taken away, which claimed the sovereignty of the whole island of Ireland by the whole of the Irish people. Now, that said, I voted for peace because people wanted to end what was going to be a continuation of the violence where Republicans couldn't reach their goal of militarily removing the British military occupation of Ireland, and the British military couldn't contain arisen people, and what we could have had was another 25 years of kind of pointless resistance it would be resistance for the sake of resistance. But we're now in a position through the Good Friday Agreement where people have agreed, North and South, that so long as the majority of people in the north of Ireland want to remain part of the United Kingdom, that would be de facto the position of the Northern Ireland state. Now, the demographics have changed. We are reaching a critical, pivotal point going forward where there will be enough nationalist Irish Republicans who want to vote for reunity. And there have been some polls recently, now it was by the Irish Daily Mirror, but the very fact that they're saying 70% of people in the south, and if I read the article correctly, they said up to 70% of people in the north, which kind of shocked me, were on some level in agreement going forward for a united Ireland. So, I mean, the demographics are there, the will of the people's there, and the people who have claimed that Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom, if they're truly Democrats, you know, I'm saying I'm a Democrat, I'm prepared to stay as part of the United Kingdom until the people vote otherwise. I just hope that those people who are the No Surrender Brigade and who want Irish reunification under no circumstances will just have to accept that it's time to move forward, it's time to be progressive, and it's time to leave this unionist veto and this kind of biblical fantasist DUP members who aren't in favour of same-sex marriage or bringing the 1967 Abortion Act of the North of Ireland, to leave these people behind and for the progressives to go forward together to build a new Ireland of equals. And I hope and dream that would be a socialist republic.
Now, the events that you allude to and we talked about earlier in Derry, it seemed to me, admittedly only from news media, that the people of Derry rose up and kind of tarred and feathered these so-called dissident Republicans, the placing of these red-painted hands on their property and so on, even on their person. It seemed to me that there was a almost universal revulsion at the murder of this young journalist. Was that how it felt to you in Belfast?
Well, George, the first thing I'd like to say is that I knew Lyra McKee personally on a personal level. I mean, I've spoken to her several times, and while I would no way be in touch by her death in the same way that her family and close friends are, I would do have a personal memories and fond memories of Lyra, and I know her sister Nicola, who spoke at the funeral. I know her quite well. Yes, revulsion at this tragic death, killing, murder in Derry. I don't think anyone believes that the people who went out on that night with a gun out into the public arena set out to murder Lyra McKee. I don't think that was their intention. That is a result of what happens when guns come out onto the streets. And we've already touched on the fact that there is going to be national reunification. So whether or not there is still a realm within which militant Republicans can claim that what they're doing is going to succeed is open to question. But you're always going to get this. If you remember when the Peace People started, that was when an IRA operation in the early 1970s. Somebody was shot in the car, and the car run over a couple of children. And I would be a close friend. I'd like to think of Mairead Corrigan Maguire. I mean, she's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. I stood in her company, George, outside St Anne's Cathedral whenever the funeral was taking place, I think on Wednesday afternoon around 1 o'clock. I was talking to Mairead. So, yes, there's always going to be a revulsion because it's a tragic loss of human life that's totally unnecessary. But when you see people like Theresa May and Leo Varadkar and Michael D. Higgins all coming up, and you had Arlene Foster and you had Mary Lou McDonald, you had the political classes and the establishment classes all going to St Anne's Cathedral. To my mind, I knew Lyra personally, so I feel I can say this. I don't think those people really care about her death. I don't think they really care about her as an individual. I think they were just using her death and her funeral as a political opportunity to push forward the establishment agenda of reconvening Stormont, because they want to pass the baby back to the local elected representatives so that they can wash their hands of it.
Well, controversial stuff. Thank you, Fra in Belfast. What do you think about that? What do you think about the Irish situation? 0344 499 1000. Do you think we should be trading normally weapons of death and destruction with Saudi Arabia? Do you think the Saudi foreign minister should have had the red carpet in Downing Street today or yesterday? Red carpet maybe because of the blood stains. What do you want to ask the cleverest man in England, Adam Gary of Eurasia Future? We'll be talking with him shortly about China and about the what turned out to be rather a controversial interview that I did last week on China. It's even talked about in China, and talk radio is not always top of the agenda in China. 0344 499 1000. Now, let's take a couple of messages. David Leviscon, apples. I'm sick of this scaremongering. We can live without apples. Whoever is stockpiling them needs sacking. I must say, I've not eaten an apple in many years, and I can certainly live without them. Edwina Cook says, Project Fear, George, the government has had 3 years to organise for all eventualities when we exit the EU. Project Fear. Well, of course, the reality is that both can be true. It could be Project Fear, but it could also be that the government hasn't prepared for all eventualities because it never imagined that this eventuality would ever occur. Marie says the EU itself is holding back medicines deliberately, as far as I'm concerned. After all, its roots are in chemical, financial and oil industries. These three areas still in the grip of the EU and the transnationals. And Terry says, George, the beautifully dulcet tones of Ella Fitzgerald have made me reach for an album of hers, but not before you're finished, my friend. The cleverest man in England, Adam Gary, is also a musical genius. I mean, he's a polymath. He's also a musician. He's a promoter. He's a producer. And most importantly, he's a font of musical knowledge as well as other knowledge. Adam, welcome back. Once a month we're having you in now.
It's lovely to be back.
Adam, let me ask you about Ella Fitzgerald. How do you evaluate her contribution?
Quite possibly one of the best female jazz and balladeer vocalists of the 20th century. Sarah Vaughan is another one that I hold highly in that regard. And then if we want to go a bit more modern...
Billie Holiday, you like Billie Holiday?
Exceptionally good. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if sort of Ella and Sarah are in the middle, God, it's becoming political again, then out there in left field is the great Nina Simone.
Oh, yeah.
But Ella was
I saw her, at the Albert Hall.
It's been extraordinary.
Yeah, about, it must be 25 years ago or even more than that. And she was utterly riveting. Just her for a lot of it on the stage at the piano.
That's what she was in her element there.
Yeah, utterly fantastic.
Absolutely.
So you'd say that was left field compared to Ella?
In many ways, because Ella, she was an exponent of the great American songbook. She was the female Frank Sinatra, the female Dean Martin. And she sung quite many of the same songs that were popularized by the Rat Pack. But she did it obviously in the very female, sultry, soulful style that she brought to the table. Nina was just as happy, if not more happy, at the piano, leading the band, as she was with a bow in her hair at the front of the bandstand. And by the standards of the 60s, being female, being black, playing your own piano, sometimes even being involved in the composition, that was quite left field indeed in the 1950s and 60s.
Advanced. Now, on that subject, did she suffer the same kind of problems that and we only knew this actually on her death, or most people did, on the death of Aretha Franklin. She suffered in the 60s the discrimination, bigotry, even Jim Crow, segregationist reality in the United States as late as the 1960s. Did Ella famously come up against any of that?
I'm not sure famously, but it was an occupational hazard, and a very shameful one at that any black musician or entertainer had to face. I mean, before 1964, all of the southern states in the United States were legally segregated. So even if a business owner wanted to be an integrationist, he was prohibited from doing so, not just by convention, but by these Jim Crow laws, which all came about in the 1860s and 1870s. So they were around for a good 100 years. And so it was a form of petite apartheid in the middle of the land of the free.
Yeah, extraordinary. Let me take some more calls. 0344 499 1000. Anything you want to ask Adam, of course, you are welcome. Let's take Nicola in Swindon. Go ahead, Nicola.
Good evening to you, George. Good evening, Adam. What I would like to is what are his thoughts on Donald Trump's proposed visit to the United Kingdom?
Well, I'll let him answer, of course, but I think we could do without it. We could do without that orange blimp appearing over the horizon.
I was going to refer to him as Tango Man.
You've been tangoed. Of more interest is Jeremy Corbyn's decision to decline the invitation to the state banquet. I'm not sure I would have done that if I was in his position, because, you know, his whole shtick is that he'll talk to anybody, and that's his answer when he's taxed about, you know, everyone from Jerry Adams to Hamas and Hezbollah and so on. Of course, he is prepared to meet Trump for talks. It's important to make that qualification. But then Trump won't want to meet him for talks, especially not now that he's not coming to the banquet. So, in a way, whilst that is, of course, a defence, a legitimate and respectable defence to Jeremy's decision, it effectively means that what the bookmakers consider the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is declining to meet the President of the United States, who may well be re-elected. They may actually both be in office at the same time. Adam, what do you think of that?
Well, as for the visit itself, it's a slightly more pleasant distraction from Brexit than manhandling and arresting Julian Assange. So I frankly don't care one way or the other. Heads of state come and go into various capitals all the time. Trump just happens to be a very big head of state from the world's most
big
powerful
head,
nation. Yes. And in terms of Corbyn, I'm with you on that one. I think that he's making a poor decision because as a prime minister in waiting, it's his obligation to meet fellow heads of government and state, whether it's a friend, whether it's a foe, whether they get on personally. I mean, Angela Merkel, she famously doesn't see eye to eye with Trump on a great deal of things, and she's still a personal friend of Mr. Obama. But they
even
do
though
meet...
Obama was tapping our telephone.
You know, lovers tiff, I suppose. You know, they'll get over it, and indeed they have. But I think the optics are bad, and I think knowing Jeremy Corbyn, I'm not speaking personally, but knowing of him, I think one of the reasons he doesn't want to go to the banquet isn't so much that he doesn't like Donald Trump, even though he doesn't, but I don't think he likes banquets very much, especially royal ones.
That's true, and tuxedos are not his normal garb.
Certainly not.
Either.
No.
I like tuxedos. That's one of the reasons I might have gone in his situation. Nicola, what's your own view?
I can see both sides of it, really, but I can see why Jeremy doesn't want to go, because obviously Trump is a person with completely different principles to Jeremy.
Yeah, although he'll have to meet a few of those if he becomes the Prime Minister.
But as you say, if he becomes Prime Minister, he will at some time have to go on a state visit to America, and he will be going to meet the man that he snubbed when he came to England. So I can see both sides of it. I can see why he's doing it, but I think, as you say...
I'm not entirely sure why he's doing it. I mean, there are no votes to be won in doing it. Everyone who agrees with him in this is already going to vote for him. But there are votes to lose, I think, in it. Adam, what do you think?
Absolutely, because whoever's advising him on these sorts of issues isn't doing a particularly straightforward and pragmatic job, because this will open the floodgates for the very unfair critics of Corbyn to say, wait a second, you met with ex-Secretary General of Hamas and this spokesperson for the Lebanese organization Hezbollah, but you won't meet with the President of the United States. And so it's a trap that who knows? Maybe someone said it for him maliciously. Maybe someone said it for him by omission, by a benign fit of ignorance, so to speak. But it's a bad look when the President of the United States, much like if the Queen invites one to a place, it's not really a good idea to reject it, not least because, unlike going to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, people will walk away with their head intact. The contents inside, that's a different matter, but the head itself will be physically, biologically intact.
Last word to you, Nicola.
Well, I'm looking forward to the march when Trump comes. I marched last year when he visited. I think the demo. I'm looking forward to it.
That's
again,
perfectly.
to show my disapproval.
Yeah, of course. I disapprove of practically everything he says and does. But I'm not the leader of the opposition.
No, but as you say, when he becomes Prime Minister...
There's also a protocol issue, Adam. It's just struck me.
Yeah.
Did the invitation come from the Queen herself? In which case, is Jeremy turning down an invitation from the Queen?
That's an interesting one, because it could well have come from Theresa May, which would clearly make it easier for him.
Yeah.
They don't like each other very much, obviously.
Yeah. Anyway, Nicola, thanks as always for your call. Nicola in Swindon, 0344 499 1000. We're into your hour. We're into Adam's hour. Ask Adam is coming up over the next 60 minutes or so. Terry Eaton is reaching for Ella Fitzgerald's album. I'm going to as well when I get home. John, stockpile goods are more project fear and just-in-time free market traders at work. What has happened to barcodes, tech computers, export brokers tracking goods over borders? And Bob Justice says, joining the EEC did have adverse effects on local fruit growers. I've seen a Dutch grower who cut his trees down because of subsidised French imports. Transcontinental apples aren't very eco-friendly. Speaking of Le Crunch, how's Macron's poll rating? Very good point. Macron is now in second place to Marine Le Pen in the rebranded, though it's just a change of lipstick, I think, National Front National, which is now the National Rally. She's ahead of Macron in the polls. And I think that Mélenchon, coming up on the outside left rail, is also making good progress. So the elections in France are going to be just as interesting as the elections in any other country. Patrick says, interesting thoughts from Fra when false flag... No, I don't like that, Patrick. Sorry, I'm not reading that. On the politics here, you only ever see anyone when it comes up for elections. I, for one, won't be voting this year. I've given up. Hashtag Belfast. Well, lots more on that, I'm sure, and on all the other issues that we're talking about this evening in the final hour. The number is 0344 499 1000. Ask Adam. Now, a lot of people have asked me this, Adam. Archie asks, my question to Adam, does he have any books available?
No, and there's actually an interesting reason for that. To write a book, one needs to stop doing almost everything else, particularly where other writing is concerned. And since most of the daily writing I do on EurasiaFuture.com is about current events, if I were to write a book, by the time it would get in anyone's hand, it wouldn't be current anymore. So that's my reason for taking that particular route.
But people can go to Eurasia Futures, all one word,
EurasiaFutureSingular.com and find all of my opinions and those of others.
Fantastic. And you're also available here and on the History Boys on my YouTube channel, of course. Here's one from Christina. Adam, what is the benefit of the UK trading with non-EU countries as compared to trading with EU countries?
Well, there's no reason that you can't trade with both. China's not in the European Union. The geography might give that away, but they have signed a major memorandum with Italy under the 17+1 so-called format of European nations. They're also trading freely with all of Southeast Asia, so Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. They have free trading agreements that they've got going with South Korea. They want to expand trade even with Japan. Their trade with the United States is infamous for its magnitude. That's just one example. You could point to India, you could point to South Africa, you could point, obviously, to the United States. So it's not either or. You can trade with both. The advantage of doing it on a bilateral FTA within the framework of the overall World Trade Organization rules is that people can sit down and negotiate a bespoke agreement. It's not just the EU saying you have to obey this, and if you don't like it, well, too bad.
Here's one associated, really, from Ryan. Ask Adam, how feasible would it be for a willing UK government to strike post-Brexit trade deals with countries such as Russia and China? Is it dependent on the terms of the UK's EU exit? Would no deal best facilitate this?
Well, no deal would just about only facilitate it, because the kinds of deals that the political class are talking about would keep Britain inside the EU customs union or something identical but with a different name. That means that Britain is tied into the same tariff structure and the same non-tariff barriers, which are the tricky ones, that prohibit a country like Britain from signing FTAs, free trading agreements, with China, Russia, Pakistan, India, the list goes on. And so it would only be in a situation where there was either a simple FTA with the EU or no deal, meaning WTO rules, where Britain could then go to China and go to the US and go to all these places and work out an FTA. China would be willing to do it. The US under Donald Trump would be very willing to do it. I can't see the UK and Russia getting on, but if they did, I'm sure Russia would be willing to do it, especially with all their gas riches.
In the customs union, we would also still have to implement the same economic sanctions.
Indeed.
Against trading partners. Now, nobody knows. Jeremy Corbyn's position is for a customs union, not the customs union. But I would have thought that the likelihood was the EU would seek to make a customs union as close to the customs union as possible.
Well, the very definition of a customs union, with only minor qualifiers here and there, is that you have a singular set of rules about imports and exports. So whether you call it the or it's really more of a Bill Clinton type of semantical question when he famously asked what the meaning of is. The result, however, is rather the same. And I would say, unfortunate, as someone who's pro-free trade for the entire world.
Marie McFarlane says, excellent show tonight. A special treat having the encyclopedic brain of Adam on Talk Radio. I'm asking Adam, what do you make of the historic Putin-Kim summit? I was impressed, she says.
I think it was a very big step in the right direction. A lot of people forget that in the year 2000, Putin's first year as the president of Russia, he took a state visit, one that was filled with pomp and circumstance, to Pyongyang, where he met with the current Kim's father, Kim Jong-il. And so this is a way of things coming full circle. And with the very familial style of North Korean leadership, there is something that is very much a priority when it comes to continuity. So just as a young Putin visited an old Kim Jong-il, now we have a young Kim Jong-un visiting the elder statesman Putin. So the symbolism for the two countries, which may have been lost in the wider world, was very important. And it's also important at a pragmatic level, and this, no one in the mainstream media talked about it, heaven only knows why, but South Korea is a very, very energy-hungry country. Russia is one of the world's top energy exporters. In order to build a pipeline from Russia to South Korea to give the country the gas it so desperately wants and that Russia so desperately wants to sell, it would need a situation where there's a normalization of the DPRK of North Korea's status. So behind closed doors...
It would have to go through North Korea.
Indeed. And so I can't imagine that not being talked about behind closed doors. But because neither Kim nor Putin wanted to rock Donald Trump's boat, they didn't mention it in any of their public statements.
He's essentially, Kim Jong-un has essentially asked Russia and China to help him negotiate with Donald Trump, hasn't he? Because of the failure of the Hanoi summit, he's basically saying, can you lads help me move this on.
Well, it's important to remember that even before the Hanoi summit, even into late 2018, South Korea, China, and Russia all have made a view public that they want sanctions relief and they want it now. And that can only come if the UN agrees to that. And that can only happen if the US agrees not to wield its monstrously powerful veto at the UN Security Council. So in that sense, there's a somewhat surprising to some comity between between Seoul, Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow on that issue. And so the meeting was symbolic of a reinforcement of that status quo. But it's important to remember that that status quo predates even the arrangement of the meeting, let alone the meeting itself.
The Russians gave him the real red carpet. I mean, he took his wonderful old green train. Putin turned up early, when he's normally late.
Indeed.
For meeting people. Putin was there long before Kim arrived. He was waiting for him at the door. What's in it for Russia?
Gas deals, and lots of it, because Russia is now one of the major exporters of energy in the world. Even though under Donald Trump the US may go into that upper tier, it's one of the things that Donald Trump promised, and he's delivered on it. Not a lot of people talking about that either. The US is a major net exporter of energy, but an industrializing North Korea will be incredibly energy hungry, and it would only make sense for the bulk, if not all of that energy to come from its neighbor Russia. With South Korea, as I said, they already need the energy. Right now it needs to be brought in by ship, which is vastly more expensive than bringing it by pipeline. So there is this win-win outcome that could be possible if the Korean Peninsula is able to normalize its internal situation and then strike trilateral deals with countries like Russia and, of course, like China.
Tom Jarvis asked the big question. I didn't realise Adam was a musical genius too. Can you ask him? New Order versus Happy Mondays. Who wins?
I would say New Order. I just think that they were able to begin their life as sort of an embryonic electronic fringe band playing what at one point they called future music, but boy did they ever break into the mainstream, as Depeche Mode did, as Erasure did, as a lot of these others did. And so what you saw by the early 90s, bands like New Order, who had their origins in a late 70s scene that was quite obscure, with young kids using the less expensive synthesizers that had come out in the late 70s, as opposed to the very expensive ones that were made famous by Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis and Pink Floyd in the early to mid 70s. They were able to create music that at first in its early incarnation was very atonal, very obscure. It was an acquired taste, and by 1988 everyone was dancing to it. It even gave birth in the mid 80s to Duran Duran, which everyone was dancing to.
I told you he was a polymath, didn't I? Here's Rhys on the phone. Rhys, welcome.
Hi, John.
Hi there, how are you doing? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, you've touched on it already, that I think Jeremy Corbyn's made a huge mistake not going to see Donald Trump in the state visit. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, although I am a fan of opinion and debate. And I'm also a fan of having a conversation. And even if they spoke for 3 or 4 hours and disagreed on everything, quite often, I've said this to you in the past, that you're probably one of the politicians that's made me think more than anything else. And if they had a conversation now, it might not be the day after, that day, a week later, a month later, or a year later, but something might stick in Donald Trump's mind or pop back up. They could save somebody's life, but it could stop him from doing something. I know this is off key from what you're doing at the moment, but
no, it's not. No, it's a very important contribution. To be fair to. Yeah, but to be fair to Mr. Corbyn, he did say he was happy. I don't know if he said happy, but he was certainly prepared to meet with Donald Trump. The problem is Donald Trump will not be prepared to meet with him. He has no obligation to. And would you meet somebody that had just snubbed dinner with you? I'm not sure I would. And I think that Trump is the sort of fellow that probably won't. Adam, what do you think?
Well, an elephant just walked into the room, and I can't recall that Jeremy Corbyn ever threatened to send nuclear rockets to the coasts of America, and I can't recall Donald Trump ever calling Jeremy Corbyn the little Labour man. Those epithets, with a bit of an adjustment, were that which Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were throwing at each other throughout 2017. What that shows is that Trump, for all of his faults, virtues, and the rest of it, he's capable of making unusual friendships. And the real signpost of that is if he can meet with Kim and talk about love letters that they send one another, then frankly, he can meet with and maybe even get on with anyone. So I wouldn't exclude Corbyn and Trump seeing eye to eye, not least because behind closed doors, I suspect they're both straight shooters.
Rhys, what do you think?
I think there's more. I think there's a greater amount at stake than Jeremy Corbyn should put that aside. But if once Adam's on, I don't know if this is allowed. I don't know if you can.
Yeah.
I was re-listening to Tony Benn and Roy. What's his name?
Jenkins.
That's it. Roy Jenkins having a debate about the EU the other day, the Brexit debate. The economics of that debate, which Tony Benn eloquently put, seemed very similar to the economics of what was going on now. And I was wondering what your opinion on that was.
Well, I think I can't probably go into that because it probably strays into electoral territory. Adam, can you, in as inoffensive a way as possible, relate to that question?
Well, I think that if Tony Benn were alive today, things would be a great deal different. Because he was the elder statesman, by the end of his career, there were very few people other than the real sort of Norman Tebbit-style polecat trainers that were willing to oppose him. He almost became a figure, an oracle that people would seek wisdom from, rather than someone who, unlike in the rest of his career, would want to go up against, like that famous debate with Jenkins from 1975. So I think that's another way in which the decorum of debate has gone down a few rungs since Mr. Benn's death, because whilst we have a lot of people who are young and virile that are talking about these important issues, people like yourself, George, people like Nigel Farage and others, we don't have someone with the subsequent amount, the requisite amount of grey hairs to make it so that people take the issue seriously, irrespective of childish and dogmatic tribalism.
Yeah, I mean, I knew Mr. Benn very well, and I defeated Mr. Jenkins, dumped him out of Parliament. Both of them were figures of enormous substance. Both
Indeed.
of them held great offices of state and over many, many years. And I think it's true to say that they haven't really been replaced, that generation of statesmen and women, because I include Barbara Castle very much in that, Peter Shore. Rhys, thanks very much for that call. Must press on. Let's take a quick break. Now, Helen is a woman caller and a first-time caller. I have no idea of her point of view, but if she disagrees with me, that'll definitely be a treble. Helen, welcome.
Hello.
In Huddersfield.
Hiya.
Welcome.
Hi, George and Adam. Hi.
Hi there.
So I'm neither young nor virile, but I do have a bit of grey hair. The point has been made that Corbyn has said he would meet Trump, so really we're just looking at the fact that he doesn't want to carouse with him. I voted Leave in the referendum with a slightly heavy heart because almost all of my friends are Remainers. But one of the narratives that I have picked up from friends and I think from the media is, oh, well, once we leave Europe, we'll just run straight into the arms of another master, and i.e. America, you know. And I'm sure that goes round health circles that, oh, yeah, well, it'll just let America run all over us, you know. So isn't it just as well for Corbyn to reassure people that leaving one unreasonable master in the EU doesn't mean running into the arms of another one?
Well, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It depends what government we have and vote for, and whether we go along with any government that we have that wants to deliver us to a master. I think the point I would make is that we can change our government, but we can't change the EU. And the EU has already presided over tremendous privatization and commercialization of our public services.
Yes. They were negotiating TTIP, and our elected representatives had to make a very strong case to go in and see where the negotiations had got to.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, because they were secret.
Yes.
So, take your chance. I'd rather take my chance with a democratically elected and removable British government than an unelected and irremovable EU Commission. That's just my personal preference. No, I think it's a matter of realpolitik, the issue of whether you turn down the invitation to the Queen's dinner for Trump. If I'm thinking with an electoral hat on, I think it's potentially a vote loser for Jeremy Corbyn in certain...
Well, it won't be the first time Corbyn's done that, will it?
No.
He doesn't really,
Yeah, but he kind of has to. But if you're going to be the Prime Minister, you have to look like you can do the job as Prime Minister. And there is an element of the electorate, I'm judging, this is my judgment, there's an element of the electorate that will look poorly on this decision. And it isn't really covered by the point that you made, Helen, that he is prepared to meet him. The point is, the leader of the opposition in a country has no automatic right to discuss anything with the President of the United States or the President of any country, actually. No automatic right at all. And as I recall, Jeremy met, and he was right to do so, with the President of China. Now, I admire China, though I have some significant differences with it. And I was happy that Jeremy Corbyn did meet the President of China. But there are many people who will tell you or argue to you that, the human rights in China and so on are such that the leader of the Labour Party should not have met with them. You see where I'm going with this? There are real problems, I think, with putative prime ministers, particularly ones that are, in one sense, according to the bookies, just actually waiting in the wings to become the prime minister, making big international judgments like not accepting this invitation. Adam.
Yeah, and again, the more I think about it, I think it's the schmoozing. I think it will be the 10 different forks and knives made out of silver and gold, the tuxedo and the rest of it, that actually turns Corbyn off more than meeting Trump. But the thing is, look, there was a Henry of Navarre, or Henri, I suppose I should say, when he became King of France, the first Protestant to ever become the King of France, he had to become a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, before he could put the crown on his head. And he uttered a famous slogan, a famous statement. He said, Paris is worth the Mass. I think Corbyn should say number 10 is worth McDonald's with Donald Trump.
Well, I don't think I could improve on that, Helen. Could you?
It isn't McDonald's he's being invited to, obviously. Not that that would be any better.
They can go to McDonald's after.
Yeah, but, I mean, who knows? That's maybe what Trump has requested as his dietary, any dietary requirements.
When our children used to plead to go to McDonald's, and they never did with us.
Well, mine still do, and I feel cruel every time we drive past one. When I'm saying, no, we'll look for somewhere nice. Daddy, there's a McDonald's.
Yeah, please, can we go to McDonald's?
Yeah. No, as far as I know, none of my children have eaten in McDonald's, though they could be deceiving me behind my back.
They must go to other birthday parties, surely.
Helen, thank you for a wonderful call. Helen in Huddersfield. Christina, kind of making your point, I think. I assume the public are paying for the banquet, and I feel giving the red carpet treatment to Trump is insulting to the people Trump has shown prejudice to. Corbyn offered to have a meeting with Trump. There's no need to spend a fortune on Trump or anyone. Well, I've made my view on that known. Scouser Larsky says, ask Adam, what do you think the future holds for North Korea? Will Trump manage to persuade them to get rid of their nuclear program? Perhaps Kim Jong-un is thinking about what happened to Libya after they got rid of their nuclear program.
Well, I'm not infamous for being an optimist, but when it comes to North Korea, I am actually incredibly optimistic. First of all, we can discount the Libyan scenario, attractive though it does seem, and there's an important reason for that. In the mid-2000s, Libya was all but abandoned by its traditional Cold War allies, mainly the former Soviet Union, Russia. It was in a precarious state where it had kissed and made up, to put it mildly, with the West after 2003, but the West wasn't living up to its economic end of the bargain. Gaddafi made his feelings very well known about that. Libya's closest allies, and this is both a tribute and a fault, by the time 2011 came, were some of the poorest developing countries of Africa that looked up to Libya, not least because Libya was offering a pan-African gold standard, an African gold-backed dinar that could really help Africans to bring their destiny into their own hands. And while we're on Libya, while Gaddafi's reputation in the Arab world and in Europe is quite low, in sub-Saharan Africa it remains quite high. And if Nelson Mandela, the great man himself, was still alive, he would acknowledge it, as he did until his dying day. Turning back, though, to Northeast Asia, I'm incredibly confident. First of all, as a country that's located next to Russia and China, there's not going to be another war. This isn't the 1950s. The next war is going to be a nuclear war. It will be the last war, and no one's going to risk that over North Korea, let alone North Korea itself, forgetting the threats of 2 years ago. The reason I'm optimistic is that the US, China and Russia, and indeed South Korea, see in North Korea tremendous economic potential. And Kim Jong-un has said in his speeches made internally that frankly should be well reported, even though they're not. He's talking about embracing the fourth industrial revolution, becoming a hub of artificial intelligence. He's talking about modernizing the economy, and already we're seeing baby steps, but nevertheless noticeable ones, in that direction of Deng Xiaoping-style market socialism. It's early days, but we are seeing this. And Trump, don't mistake him for a fool just because he can be a bit crass. He wants a Trump hotel in central Pyongyang just as much as China wants Belt and Road connectivity, and just as much as Russia wants oil and gas connectivity. So, forgetting the rhetoric...
I've stayed in the very hotel that he'll try and put his name on, I must tell you. Now, this is the Open University of the Airwaves. Our professor in the north is Donald in Inverness, our campus in Inverness. Donald, welcome.
Yes, welcome, George. We do have a white campus here, the campus of the Highlands, but I won't take up time with that. But George, I want to pick up an interesting phrase you mentioned and to bring in Adam's thoughts on it. But first, can you expand upon what you said at the beginning there about your little spring-heeled Macron's French police knocking out someone's eyes and a few other...
Yes, more than 20 people have had their eyes knocked out.
Oh, dear.
And more than 5, it may now be approaching 10, have had their hands blown off by the grenade power with which certain crowd control weapons are being used.
Terrible stuff. Terrible. I like your phrase, little spring-heeled Macron.
Yeah, well, I, as you can tell, I'm not his biggest admirer.
No, but your vocabulary, your teaching is all some good vocabulary, George.
Well, thank you.
Although
you
I must
too.
correct you on one. You said about universal something. People use the word universal when they mean global or widespread, but that's another matter. Let's get back to the point that we want to bring, Adam. You mentioned how you were talking about Robin Cook's ethical policy.
Yeah, it didn't last long. It wasn't all that ethical anyway.
He voted for the war in Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
I've got his biography in my hand as I speak. I was reading his biography the day he died in hill walking here, not very far from where I'm living.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is this: you said this speaking with one of your contributors. I think it was Tara McCormick. You said, "How do we democratize our foreign policy?" Now, as we know at general elections, it's usually domestic issues, but nevertheless, they have a foreign policy. But that's not what gets people elected. And then once they're in power, they slip in whatever they like.
That's true.
So that's a very interesting phrase.
Yeah, that's true, Donald. But if you recall, right after the Iraq War, there was terrorist atrocity on the trains in Madrid.
Yeah.
And the then Prime Minister, Aznar, the right-wing Prime Minister of Spain, ally of Bush and Blair in the Iraq War, he tried to blame it on Basque separatism, which was a deliberate falsehood. It had been because he couldn't bear to be held to account for his own policy towards the Arab world, the Muslim world, his participation in the Iraq War. He lied about the provenance of this terrorist atrocity. And that foreign policy issue, admittedly with the domestic element of a terrorist attack, brought the Aznar government down. So there are some circumstances, I would say, where foreign policy can be, for good or ill, a real feature or factor in domestic elections. How do we democratize foreign policy, Adam?
Well, there's one easy way, except for an instance where one's own country is directly attacked, hold a referendum on whether to go to war. If you can have Parliament vote for whether they want to invade Iraq or Syria or Libya, etc., then why not ask the people? I'm a big fan of referenda. Just look what Brexit's done.
Me too, I always win them.
Indeed. So maybe you can win some more. I know which side you'll be voting on in a war referendum, surely on the no side. And so I think that's absolutely a good way to do it. And you couldn't conceivably say it's a security risk because, one, Parliament already votes on it. So the cat of a war might be coming your way, Mr. Defenseless Nation, is already well out of the bag. And two, because the nations that countries like Britain tend to follow the United States into attacks against, they're defenseless nations that couldn't fight back even if they had advance notice. Let the people decide. Hold referenda. Lots of them.
Thanks for that, Donald, our professor in our Highlands faculty. Jane A. asks, Jane Ackroyd Brown, a very fine friend of the show, Adam, were certain Ella songs banned by the BBC because of the drug association in the US with jazz?
There were, and the BBC had a very precarious relationship with jazz. I mean, the BBC has been censoring music even more recently than that. There's the famous instance of the Frankie Goes to Hollywood song, Relax, having the DJ take the vinyl record out of the player and break it in front of the microphone once the innuendo of the lyrics sort of dawned on him. But the BBC, prior to the end of the 1940s, was totally anti-jazz. The BBC was quite snobby. There was an anti-American tinge to the ideology, and it was obviously particularly anti-jazz, which was always an art form associated with African Americans. What gradually changed is that when the American GIs were in Britain during and after the Second World War, they brought their music with them, and so the British radio stations needed to play what America liked. Now it sounds like reverse colonialism, but it did actually help to democratize the British airwaves at the time when there was literally only one show in town. This was decades before Radio Caroline and all the other pirates that brought us the music that we love. So that's the medium-sized answer. I suppose if you want the longer one, the History Boys is the place to turn.
It is. Now, SFL, again, a very smart man, he says, George, would you be kind enough to ask Adam his thoughts on Mongolia's potential as a player in Asian geopolitics, as it has a massive reserve of natural resources, yet is rarely talked about?
Well, President Xi has actually received his Mongolian counterpart. The reason Mongolia is not talked about very much is that it's one of the most sparsely populated countries in the world, but it does have resources that can be tapped on a win-win basis. And in terms of connectivity, it's in a pretty interesting location. Funnily enough, one of the few times I've ever seen Mongolia talked about in depth in what we can broadly call the Western media was Jeremy Clarkson and company on his new show, The Grand Tour. They went for an hour driving across Mongolia, which gives people the idea of how desolate it is.
It's the largest grasslands in the world.
Indeed. And those grasslands could potentially be filled with pipelines. The environmentalists might have something to say, but there's always compromises to be made. So yes, Mongolia is certainly part of Belt and Road. No great walls being built there. It's all about increased connectivity. So it is a country to watch, though, because because of its sparse population and lack of urban development, we don't hear about it very much, unless you're a Jeremy Clarkson fan.
It was, of course, a Soviet republic.
Yeah.
What is it now? Who's ruling there now? Is it the ex-party people, or is it moved on, as we say?
It's more or less the ex-party people, but they've managed to keep things generally pragmatic. And again, because it's got a small population, you don't see the political issues being as convoluted as they potentially could be in the other Central Asian republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, whose leader is doing his long stepping down. This is Nursultan Nazarbayev, who renamed his major city after himself, being the modest chap that he is, a friend of Tony Blair no less. But in Mongolia, because the population is sparse, it's not as much of a political hot potato as some other countries could potentially be.
Let's take a quick break. Tom Jarvis says, from New Order to Mongolia, without hesitation, Adam Gary has a computer for a brain. Indeed, he does. The Red Resistance asks, as Adam's a musician, I'd be interested if he has read They All Loved Jack, where Bruce Robinson of Withnail and I fame suggests Jack the Ripper was possibly the composer Stephen Adams, who wrote the song Holy City. It's a great read, says the Red Resistance. Have you?
No, that's one. I've never heard that theory, that Jack the Ripper is a musician.
Stephen
But there
Adams.
was a famous session drummer called Jim Gordon who played with anyone and everyone from Eric Clapton, Steve Winwood, and everyone else in the sort of 60s, 70s, who then accidentally shot, I believe, a family member because his mental state was rapidly declining. And many musicians actually rallied to support, saying he's not a violent killer, he should be in a mental rehabilitation ward rather than with the common killers, but that didn't work out.
Let's take Richard from Manchester. Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, good evening, George, and Adam, thank you for having me on. I was a little bit upset this week, George, at the fact that Nancy Pelosi had come across on the Friday when that girl was murdered, and the first thing she said, obviously she didn't know about that at the time, was that there would be no deal for the UK. This was all done within a few minutes of getting off the aircraft if we Brexit, and particularly a reference to, I hope you don't upset our peace agreement. So in one way it was rather prophetic that something was going to happen. And then after the girl was murdered, and it was a very, very moving funeral, and that priest, if he's done anything to bring a permanent peace to Ireland, it would be absolutely wonderful, because I thought the Catholic priest was great.
He was terrific, yeah.
He was, the way he put it across. But then we have the insult, if I can put it that way, of Clinton ringing up the day after and apologising for the girl's death. And in my own mind, I actually got onto talk radio with one of your colleagues, Mike Graham, and expressed the view that these people, I don't think they even know, probably Clinton knows a little bit more about Ireland, but Pelosi wouldn't. The fact that, you know, it's a very, very delicate situation, and I felt that they'd stirred something up which wasn't necessary. Having said that, I hope the young girl's death, and I hope that priest and these politicians get together and make something of it.
Well, they're complaining now about Facebook ads from foreign countries influencing their politics and their elections. We've now had President Obama and now Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi openly instructing us on our national politics, on our internal affairs. You're absolutely right. I just need to press on because of the hour, Richard, because I need to ask you something, Adam. Last week I had a discussion with a professor from SOAS, which you took great exception to.
Indeed.
News of it has travelled, I know, from diplomatic sources. It did not go down well in China. Tell us in a nutshell what you found most offensive about my interview.
I think that the fact that he was willing to draw conclusions about China that are authored by people who have never been to China, who are predisposed to hating China, and who can't produce any evidence to back up their claims, but instead just create a wellstorm of hysteria that attempts to provoke a situation that no one wants. Everyone ought to want peace, and peace is prevailing in China from its incredibly prosperous Pacific coast to western regions that are now receiving more development and more vocational opportunities for the people and more educational opportunities for the people than in their history. Now, very wicked sources in the world are trying to provoke a clash between the majority of Han Chinese and Muslims. This comes at a time when China and its all-weather friend and neighbor Pakistan are working to build a better life for both people via the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which will link effectively the Pacific coast and the wider Asia-Pacific region with the port at Gwadar in the Arabian Sea on the Indian Ocean. China has always had good relations with multiple Islamic countries. A man that we both admire very much, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, made a very important speech just hours ago at the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. And so I think the insinuations that we heard last week, and I can't comment on the man, but on the content, I think they were very provocative.
He is the director of the China Institute at SOAS. It's not a small position. It's a very prestigious one.
And he's entitled to his views. I'm just offering a counter view, and I'll let the people decide for themselves. Investigate it, but investigate it deeply. Don't let your investigation start with the letter B and end with the letter C, with another B in between. I'll put it that way.
Now, let me go through some more of the messages because we're running out of time. Atakan Ozon says, my question to Adam is, what do you think is the best possible deal for the UK exiting the EU?
I think the UK should leave on WTO terms, saying, see you, we wouldn't necessarily want to be you. And then once the dust settles, once we're in contractual law, you have this term called a cooling off period, then go back and say, we want to do a free trading agreement. And while we wait for you to reply to that offer, we're going to send our envoys to China, to the United States, to South Korea, to Pakistan, to India, to South Africa, to Australia, to Nigeria, to the multiple islands of the Caribbean with a lot of Commonwealth affinity, and we'll let Juncker decide over a nice glass of wine what he wants to do with that email.
Does he drink? Let's press on. X-Ray Vision says, I voted Remain, albeit holding my nose. But if we were to really have a proper Brexit, wouldn't it be futile with the US deep state telling us who we can and can't deal with? Would be like driving with the handbrake on. Well, I've kind of answered that already. We'll get the government we vote for. And the good thing is, we can always vote it out. With the EU, we can't. Mal says, ask Adam, can the Republic of Ireland swallow Northern Ireland to get a united Ireland and cater for extra expenditure on its own? Or will they need a serious influx of European monetary backup to accomplish that?
Well, Northern Ireland is smaller than East Germany, and it's much more similar to the Republic of Ireland in economic and, dare I say, political terms than North Korea is to South Korea. So the short answer is that it won't be as extravagant a monetary and fiscal responsibility as was German unification, but the EU will have to chip in. And after all, the EU's been trying to tell Irish people...
They'd be delighted, wouldn't they? It's their number one preoccupation. They're so in love with Ireland.
Well, the EU's in love with a lot of things, but putting its money where its mouth is isn't one of them. But they'd have to do it, and it wouldn't be all that expensive compared to other unification issues.
Now, there's a legend on the line, so I need to take her. She is the professor from our Bristol faculty. It's the legend. That is Norma.
I'm not that clever, George. I want to get serious a little bit. I know it's late at night. And tell Adam, I think Ella at Fitzgerald had perfect pitch.
Perfect pitch.
Perfect. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, Adam agrees.
But the thing about wanting to get serious, if Corbyn got together with Trump, they'd be poles apart. For example, Trump would probably he doesn't sign the non-proliferation treaty. He might proliferate his nuclear weapons. Corbyn wants to disarm our nuclear weapons.
No, he doesn't. No. Labour's policy. If he were allowed to, yeah. But Labour's policy is to keep the nuclear weapons.
Exactly, if he were allowed to. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, cynically, I made this point last week, and I don't want to get boring, but I think Mr. Trump would probably rather go in May, if he were here, to Westminster Abbey to celebrate our nuclear weapons, a Christian service led by the Queen of Westminster.
But you're missing, I think, my point, Norma, that if you're the Prime Minister of a country, you can't only have dinner with people with whom you agree.
No.
Barack Obama killed far more people than Donald Trump has. Barack Obama committed far more crimes even than Donald Trump has. But the liberal intelligentsia and political class were falling over themselves. They would have given the right arm to a dinner invitation with Barack Obama.
Yeah, but maybe so. I was just actually making a general statement when I just thought perhaps we get serious about if they got together and had a talk, they'd be poles apart.
Yeah. Although you don't rule out Adam's point that Trump, you couldn't get more poles apart than Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. I mean, talk about little and large. And yet they seem to have struck up a pretty good relationship. Adam, what do you say to Norma's point?
Well, at the end of the day, again, I wouldn't discount Trump and Corbyn getting on, because we have to remember the real Jeremy Corbyn is not a liberal. He's a classical straight-shooting leftist. So he's not Justin Trudeau, with whom Trump doesn't get on. He's not members of the Democratic Party, with whom Trump famously doesn't get on. He's not Angela Merkel. I think the two of them might walk away from that meeting actually enjoying it, because I don't think Donald Trump has ever met someone in his life like Jeremy Corbyn, and I'd be willing to bet my house on the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's never met anyone like Trump.
He might have to fight someone like Jeremy Corbyn if Bernie Sanders is able to get the nomination for the Democratic Party. But I don't think Corbyn would get on with him. I'd be disappointed if he ended up liking him.
It would be tense, but I think it could be interesting.
But the point is, you can't just meet people that you get on with. You can't just meet people, not if you want to be taken seriously as the Prime Minister in waiting. Because people have got to believe that if on day X you're in Downing Street as the Prime Minister, you're able to do political and economic business with other leaders. Isn't that the case?
100% true. And I think that politics has become very infantilized by this idea that you can only talk to someone or be friendly with someone that you agree with 100% of the time. I don't agree with anyone 100% of the time. Even what I said a week ago, I might have changed my mind based on the facts a week later. So I don't even agree with myself 100% of the time, because I am consistent. But one must change their policies and one must change their viewpoints as the facts around them change.
Well, as Professor Einstein said, when the facts change, so do my opinions.
There is just one further irony to this. Jeremy Corbyn, if he becomes Prime Minister, won't be able to get to choose which leaders he meets with and doesn't. But ironically, whoever is the US President gets to choose which nations to sanction. So there is a bitter irony in this whole saga.
Yeah, we'll have to watch them. If Corbyn gets in, they might be sanctioning us. David says, ask Adam, if we left with no tariffs imposed on the UK, would be close to 7 billion. Tariffs imposed on the EU by the UK would be close to 13 billion. Why would they cut off their noses to spite their face? David's overarching point is true, isn't it? That the EU is a capitalist club, and capitalists, in the end, want to do business, don't they?
Absolutely, and the German businessmen behind the scenes are privately embarrassed of people like Guy Verhofstadt, or however one says that mouthful. They see this man flailing like a sort of fat Herbert von Karajan at the European Parliament, and they're just thinking, oh, for God's sake, we want to sell BMWs to people in Chelsea. And at the end of the day, logic will prevail. The funny thing about the EU is once it's exhausted all all other possibilities, it will compromise.
Now, I can't say this, Phraortes, Fraortes says, Corbyn's not the only prominent politician to decline the invite to the Trump banquet. Why is no one mentioning leader of the Lib Dems, Vince Cable, or Speaker of the House, Bercow? Well, Mr. Classical Name, I think you just answered your own question. Now, I'm really sorry to all the callers and messengers who didn't make it onto the show. I know that a very large number of you wanted to ask Adam. One or two of you even wanted to ask me. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. And if it was, come back next week at the same time, same place, God willing.